It's very non-traditional, but we now have 48 nuclear startups in the nation, and the hardware perspective is not something that was typically done as a startup. What made you guys pursue the startup path instead of another approach?
Well, I'll jump in on that one. I think that you're right that nuclear or even robotics tend to be capital intensive at the end of the day, and having to raise a lot of capital to do your startup is a challenge. I think it's often that's why so many venture firms are focused on software and apps now. But nevertheless, I think if the market is big enough and the opportunity is big enough, then I think the capital is available. So, certainly in our case, I guess I love being in startups. I think it's super fun. You literally do everything from raise money to fix the printer in the same day, and that's you have to relish that. You have to like doing that. And so why did we start it this way? I think there wasn't any other way to do it necessarily. I think that's just the way it is.
I think nuclear in particular has immense opportunities for more vertical integration. Like right now, nuclear is dominated by larger, in many cases, slow-moving companies that have a lot of inertia. They don't have any need to operate on faster cycle times, exactly as you said. And so if you are a startup, if you grow in a clever way, you can make something that's extremely vertically integrated, and you can have things operate on faster cycle times. And similar things have been done in aerospace in the past. To kind of draw on the SpaceX example again, they basically take in raw metal at one end of the factory and rocket ships come out of the other end. And by doing that, they avoid all of the timeline delays that you typically get with aerospace contractors. So I think there's a lot of room for nuclear to emulate that in many ways. So that's why I wanted to do it in startup mode.
The reason I do startups is because I'm utterly unemployable. So the only way for me to actually have a job is to create a company and make myself an officer of that company. Now that sounds cheeky, but actually, I think it takes a very specific kind of personality to run a startup. It's certainly not easy, and I mean, if you walk into a job in a corporation, you have infrastructure wrapped around you. I mean, you're almost like you just go into your allocated space, and you do follow the instructions and do what you're supposed to do. In the startup, there are no instructions. There's no infrastructure. There's no office. There's nothing. You have to create it all out of nothing. So, the labor force doesn't want me. That's fine. I don't know if I particularly want them, and I think you have to have quite a different mindset to want to do it yourself, to want to make it yourself. So I wouldn't be too worried if you're thinking of doing a startup and having a big problem getting a job. It's probably a good sign.
What would you have done differently if you had started over today with all the knowledge and experience that you've had?
So in startups, and even more so in nuclear startups, it's important to start the hiring process for additional employees very, very early on, like way before you think you need the person, because it's kind of a narrow pipeline of people in nuclear who are like both have the necessary technical skill set and also are interested in working in a startup. Like there are not very many people, so you have to find them like super, super early on, and so you don't kind of run into a crunch where you're like, all right, well, I have funding and I need to hire people, but I can't quite find them yet. Like we've been so lucky in that our team is like amazing and perfect and wonderful, and I want like 3 clones of each of them, and then my life would be perfect. But yeah, if you can find people who are extremely self-directed and like have the technical background and are like co-conspirators in a way, who are completely aligned with your mission, and that is ideal. Also, if anyone here has a thermal hydraulics background and is graduating soon, definitely please get in touch with me.
I would definitely echo that. I think the hiring before you think you need it is such a big point, and I said earlier that this is my 3rd startup, and I'm still learning that lesson, because by the time oh my gosh, we need this role, like in our case, we needed a head of computer simulation, and by the time you sort of figure out that we needed that, then you start a process, and that's a hard person to find, and it takes a really long time, and then you've gone a year, not having a key role, for example. So I completely agree with that. I think second, at an early stage, that the first people you hire, the first 10 people of your company, define the culture basically forever for that company. So those people need to be a cultural fit even more than anything, and those people are going to likely be utility players that can do a lot of different things over time. And on that note, another lesson would be there was always choices between do we hire a domain expert, so someone who is quote unquote an expert in a very specific domain, or do you hire a really smart person who can learn? And kind of gone back and forth on that a bunch, and I would say my strong conclusion would be hire the smart person that can learn, because that person tends to be able to adapt over time, and their role, everyone's role evolves over time when you're in the first 10. So that would be one. I think second, learned this the hard way, which is at the beginning you just want to raise money, and you sort of don't care where the money comes from. Money's money, and hey, that's great, I can get my company started. And that's a wonderful thing at the beginning, but then as that plays out, you have to be aligned with your investor also. And so being a little bit picky about your investor, even if it means it's going to take a little longer, is totally worth it over the long term. Because if you and the investor are not aligned, or investors are not aligned from the beginning, things go off the track, and can go off the track pretty quickly. And then the last point would be kind of echoing what you said, which is, it's always amazing how many people will talk to you about your idea or your startup. For example, I talked about simulation. One of the things we're trying to do is sort of take fusion simulation from where it is today, which honestly isn't very good, to kind of the next level. So I just decided, hey, I'm going to call the head of climate modeling for NASA and just talk to him, see what he does, what he says, what codes he uses, how does he do it, lessons learned. And of course, he was very happy to talk to us. And you can do that kind of in any domain. People are always willing to give you advice, and you can decide whether to take it or not. So again, pushing on that vein of being open and sharing your ideas, sharing where you are, ends up building momentum for your startup. So a bunch of lessons there. I'm still learning, by the way.
I find this quite a difficult question to answer. What would I do differently? Because when you do startups, it's always a journey, and even if you make big mistakes, it's absolutely essential that you make those mistakes, so that you can not make those mistakes again in the future. So I've founded a number of companies. Some of them were very successful, and some of them were big failures. And you need to have those failures so that you can have future successes. They can't all be failures. You have to have a winner in there somewhere. The single biggest mistake I made is actually led to the formulation of my number one rule in business, which is never be the smartest person in your company. If you find yourself in a situation where you seem to be way more intelligent than everybody else, I would be extremely worried. The biggest successes I've had is when I've been a partner with someone who has a great intellect and who I definitely feel intellectually inferior to. And it doesn't make me uncomfortable, it actually makes me feel really, really good. It makes me feel like, I'm not sure, relieved, that I'm not, like the whole company's not resting on my, my shaky IQ. The biggest failures I've had is when I felt like my partner was an idiot, basically. But again, you have to suffer through those trials. I think it's absolutely essential. You have to, don't be afraid to make mistakes, because the biggest thing is you just have to try something. it may not be the right thing. It might be a failure, but you know, it's if you don't try anything, then nothing will happen.
How do you address that? How do you decide, you know, do I want to join or do I want to do something different?
As far as I'm concerned, the more innovation, the better. If you think you want to undergo the journey of doing a startup, then by all means, I encourage you to do that. I think the response that you get from companies like the ones represented here today would be support. You know, support anything you want to do. I mean, we all get support from companies that are bigger and more successful than we are. You know, someone who wants to try something new. If there's no, I mean, that's what this is all about. It's about innovation. I mean, if you're thinking about just joining us, then maybe you're missing the point. We have to have new, more, better technologies. If somebody came along and with an idea which was way better than ours, I'd be sad that I'd lose my company, but I'd be happy that the world is gaining a newer, better technology. So if you think you have the fortitude to undertake, making your own company, then I strongly encourage you to do that.
And something in what you said, you hinted that we're somehow competing with each other up here, or we'd be in competition with you. And I don't think of it that way at all. At this point, I think the biggest barrier, certainly to, I think, fission and fusion, is kind of where the industry is from a perception standpoint, the amount of capital that's required. So the more startups there are, the more innovation. It's sort of that rising tide lifts all boats concept. For example, despite the fact that TriAlpha is a little bit secretive, we still have people from TriAlpha up and kind of run them through our data all the time and say, hey, here's where we are, here's where we're totally stumped, what do you think? We've been down there as well. So, you know, to the extent TriAlpha succeeds, it's good for us too. And I think, you know, this isn't the software. We're not trying to create an app or like a Pokemon Go competitor. You know, we're in a different stage. So I think all of us, whatever your startups are, we'd all be happy to help, you know, get you guys going as much as we could.
Yeah, like selfishly, you all should join us, but objectively, I think like having additional nuclear startups, especially at this point when the market is so new, like having additional advanced nuclear startups kind of validates the space, and when others do well, it's exactly as you said, it's a rising tide lifts all boats. Also, more concretely, I think now is an exceptionally good time to be raising capital for a startup, and that could very easily not be the case, you know, a year or 2 or 3 from now, depending on how world events go. So if you want to do one, like now-ish is exactly the right time to go for it on your own.
From the perspective of us, from a selfish perspective, what's best, and also from the perspective of the species, what's best. So what's best for, you know, us collectively. Is it best for us to chase that idea and potentially not finish our PhD, or is it best to stick and do it simultaneously, or what's best?
Do both. Tough it out. It's super fun in retrospect. At the time, not so awesome. But yeah, if it's at all feasible to finish your PhD, there's immense value in both having the degree and the process of getting and defending that degree, and even just the time management skills necessary for doing both at the same time. It's a stretch. It was definitely a stretch for me personally, but it's extremely worthwhile, and lots of things afterwards just feel very easy in comparison.
Some of the most successful people out there say, oh look, they dropped out of Harvard or something like that, and yet they've been so successful. I think those are isolated examples. When you have a startup, you're starting from zero, and you have zero credibility. So you need as much help as you can possibly get adding that credibility. Finish the doctorate. Get those letters in the company, in your startup company, whatever it is. You just have that little bit more credibility. if I were you, I would finish the PhD.
My question is, how do you raise initial capital for a startup company?
Well, you start by going to your checkbook. And yeah, the first checks always have to come from founders. I mean, that's just, I think that's pretty standard. Ask your family, your friends. Those are the first rounds always have to be very personal. And you know, if your friends and your family aren't going to believe in it, then you know, good luck going out and convincing a complete stranger. The very first rounds have to come from your own personal circle, including your own savings.
Well, I think
I was gonna say I would disagree with that because one time I took some money from a family member, and you know, family relationships are already hard enough. Trying to you lose money for your friends and family is no fun, and the chances of your startup losing money are pretty high. And people say they understand that, but then they don't. You know, at the end of the day. So I think, as you were saying earlier, this is a good time to raise money. And the two startups that I founded, we put in a little bit of money, but you know, mostly just kind of sweat equity. Took a bunch of time where we weren't didn't have a salary. And then, you know, I think there's a lot of opportunities in incubators today that certainly weren't there 10 years ago. Crowdfunding, depends on what you're trying to do. There's opportunities there. So most people, I think you're right, that probably more than half of startups do raise money from friends and family, but I think my preference would be not to do that.
Founders. I mean, the first question you're going to get when you visit an investor is, how much of your own money is in this? And you have to be able to answer that question.
I've never
Well,
had
I
that
think-
question.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I haven't. The question that I've gotten is, you know, what is your ownership share, depending on how you structure the founding documents. And like for me personally, my ownership share comes from sweat equity at the beginning. I didn't put my own money into it because I was a starving grad student at the time. I didn't have any physical dollars to put into it. I just had my time at the beginning. And similarly, I think it can get like fraught very quickly, like if you're asking family members or friends for funding. And I think that, you know, if your idea is strong, you can get people whom you aren't already acquainted with who are interested in like putting in money. Like, you know, when Mark and I first started talking publicly about our idea, you know, we gave a TEDx talk like about 5 years ago, and there were two people just who happened to be in the audience of that TEDx talk who said, like, this is amazing, like, how much money have you raised? And we're like, kind of none. And they were like, we would like to come in and do a debt round. And so we did that, and kind of from that base of those two people who just like super fortuitously happened to be interested, we were able to, you know, build up some other people within the Boston area, and other people we knew through MIT networks, including Ray Rothrock, who helped do our first like 1.5 million-ish debt round. And so that came together pretty straightforwardly for us without having to go to friends and family.
Either with your current startups or maybe some of the startups you did before, I was just wondering if there was a single event that was like your biggest hurdle and how you guys like overcame that and what you learned from it.
The biggest hurdle in startups is actually being successful, because what happens then is you graduate from being a startup to actually being a company with infrastructure and bureaucracy, and you know, the people that are involved in the startup phase are, as I said earlier, a very unique personality. I mean, it's you almost need a type of person that has very little ability to focus on one thing for no longer than 10 seconds. But then, as you progress, you have to be extremely focused, and those people don't do well in bureaucracy often, I find. And yeah, it creates tension. You know, people who are involved in the birthing of this thing all of a sudden find that they are either irrelevant or not useful, or they're just not appropriate, no longer appropriate for the organization. So you find yourself in an awkward situation. You may have to tell someone who's put an awful lot of energy into your project that they have to no longer be involved with the project. So yeah, getting the mindset of everybody who's involved in the startup to graduate to the next level and continue to be part of the company, that's very difficult actually.
Slow to hire and quick to fire is an expression I've heard that when I first heard it, I'm like, that's terrible. But I think it's true. It's sort of, you work really hard to find the right person, and then if that person or other people aren't working out, it's not like things are, you know, if it's kind of a disaster, you can't really improve it. You don't have the time to sort of train people. So I would echo that. I think second, you were sort of asking over there kind of points in the road where there were crossroads. And you know, I think there always are. I think a lot of them have to do with, you get to a certain point in their strategic choices about, you know, what path do you want to go down. And for example, the Harvest Power, my old company, we took organic waste material like your green bin, we made electricity out of it, and then we made soil products, which we sold in bags. So we got to a point where we had to decide: are we a waste company, are we an energy company, or are we a soil company? And you know, all three were kind of different markets, and we sort of had to. We thought we could be all three, but we really couldn't, and so we had to sort of make a decision: what are we going to be? And that had to do with, you know, what do the markets value the most, where are the margins the highest, what business was performing the best at that time. So that was one, and then the other ones tended to be, and I think they're relevant for the nuclear space too, because the capital requirements are so high. There'll be a certain point where you need to bring in a strategic, you know, potentially one of the large, you know, nuclear companies to put money in or help. And I think those are always at crossroads because they add so much credibility to your company, but at the same time, you know, they add complexity in terms of, you know, your strategy and where you want to head. And we've, in the past, always opted to take the money from the strategic because it's helped, but there's a lot of strings that come along with that. So I would say those would be the two.
I really agree with that. I think some of the biggest decisions are what larger companies are you going to partner with, and where you're going to get your rounds of funding from, which investors are you going to be working with, because deciding on a particular investor or another has enormous implications in the the culture of your company, in all of your decisions going forward. And even more so for strategic partners, because if you're going to be doing significant work in kind with them, for example, you become very closely, you become linked to their operation cycles and their timelines. And if there's sort of an impedance mismatch, then that could be very problematic.
And something I noticed while I was there was that whenever I tried to, you know, make a suggestion to something innovative, there were a lot of roadblocks there. A lot of people saying, well, it's kind of the way everybody's did it. And that really deterred me from wanting to work for, you know, kind of a big nuclear company. And that's why I love the startup mentality, because it's always encouraging new ways of doing things. And on the note of, you know, like regulatory parts, you know, like which Exelon was facing with everything, every decision they had to make. How did you, I know you might all have pretty varying opinions on this, how did you make the decision on where to base your company and whether or not to stay in America and deal with, like, you know, the NRC and the regulations versus going to somewhere else like Canada?
I can tell you from our perspective, it was a very researched approach. Despite the fact that most of us were from Canada, we decided to undertake an analysis of the global nuclear regulatory environment and to assess which was going to be the best regulatory jurisdiction to domicile the company. And good news, it was Canada. There are three very large nuclear power plants in the Greater Toronto area, so as a result of that, there is a huge corpus of skilled nuclear power expertise, and added to that, the nuclear power industry was at one point not too long ago owned and operated by the Canadian government, and in the last 7 years, that structure has been collapsed, and it's been privatized. And the result of that, from that giant body of infrastructure going from publicly owned to privately owned, there was a big rationalization of skilled personnel. So you've got hundreds, if not even, I would say, thousands of skilled nuclear personnel who have decades of experience, basically just sitting around the greater Toronto area, waiting to get a contract. A lot of them have, some, but it really was not a difficult decision with all those factors. So ours was pretty specific, but it was definitely a top-down analysis, and we didn't just decide to locate in Canada because the people were from Canada. It was a very calculated decision.
We did a similar analysis really early on, and we decided to make a bet that the U.S. regulatory system would undergo significant change in the subsequent years. This was back in, I guess, 2012, 2013, when we made the decision to focus our efforts primarily on doing a first-of-a-kind facility, a demonstration scale facility in the U.S., ideally at a national lab site. And we made that decision because the NRC remains the gold standard for reactor licensing worldwide. There's the example of the United Arab Emirates recently bought some of the Korean 1,400 megawatt electric reactors, and the Emirates required the Korean reactor designers to get NRC certification before they'd build them in the UAE. And we decided to go the U.S. route. And I've been very comfortable with that decision. There's been some times where I've been a little bit anxious about it, but over the past year, certainly even over the past 3 months, I think that there's significant, really positive motion within the NRC and greater collaboration between NRC and DOE, viewing advanced reactors as a remarkable opportunity for their organization. NRC's budget for advanced reactor evaluation was increased last year, even as the agency's overall budget was decreased. And so we think that's the best route for us going forward with our particular technology.
Are there location restrictions on a more general hardware setup?
Well, for us, so in fact, most of our clients really, there's a great need for us in Vegas, but we didn't believe that we could get, and we could build a business just there, but we didn't believe we could get the talent. And in terms of, there's pockets of Boston or Silicon Valley where, we knew we had a core thesis in who we wanted, and so it was just much easier. While it's much more expensive to start a company here, we thought team was everything in order to execute.
Just some final thought in there is, I think it is a ledger between, there's on the panel at least Canada, U.S., and then other. I think the entrepreneurial mindset of a Boston or a Bay Area can't be underestimated, and that when you're not in one of those two places, that's where most of the capital is, and the capital tends to invest in things that are local. So I think all things being equal, it's better to be in one of those two places. Agree that the regulatory regime in Canada is, I think, at this point better than in the U.S., but we're not as far along on the regulatory front as some of the other people on the panel. But I think it's also interesting that one of the groups is TerraPower coming to this thing at all? I don't know.
Do we have any reps from TerraPower?
I didn't see any. Because they...
Do we have any TerraPower reps coming at all?
Yeah. Well, the only point I was going to make is they...
I know we reached out to.
Yeah. They got to a certain point and then decided, hey, we're going to build a plant in China, and raised $500 million to do that. And so we could speak with them, but at the end of the day, it's kind of clear from their decision that doing something outside of the U.S. was better. And my guess is that had to do with money and regulatory, because I think it's hard for us to see, but again, there's just a couple of plants getting built in the U.S. and all the action is in the rest of the world. So, it's a tough call as to where you base your company, but again, if all things being equal, I think where the money is and where the entrepreneurial mindset is tends to be here or Boston.
How do you retain that startup philosophy? Because obviously things change as you become more corporate, quote unquote.
I'll take a stab at the first one.
Yeah, sorry, it's quite long.
We always maintain a Skunkworks division. I think every technology company owes it to themselves to have a Skunkworks division.
Can you explain what that is?
Skunkworks, if you don't know the term, it just means like a research which is maybe not necessarily that closely related to the baseline technology. Or maybe it is, but it's going off in different directions, basically. Being innovative, and just continuing to innovate. So yes, I think every company needs to, every technology company needs to continue to have that. We have that. We have a Skunkworks division. You know, a couple guys that that sort of think they have Asperger's, and they just sort of they do their own little thing and speak in a weird language. You know, they're ultimately dreaming of ways to make the design much, much better. And of course, we have to be focused on our baseline design because we're in the regulatory process now. And when you're dealing with a regulator, you cannot introduce sweeping design changes in the middle of a regulatory process. It is the quickest and surest way to fail the regulatory process. So you can have that, and yeah, I repeat, it's essential. So, your question was, can someone who's an innovator join a company that's already established and expect to have a role, an innovative role? Yes, I think that's quite possible. Of course, larger companies acquire smaller companies all the time, and that's in essence how they do innovate. They don't do their own innovation. They just go out and scoop up some other little guy that's done all for them. That's quite common.
I'll just say that I think the number of people in the company makes a huge difference. I remember when we started Harvest, there was just a few of us, and then it over 4 years got to 600 people, and a great amount of that startup edge was lost in that process. And my current company has about 65 people, so I think once you get to 50 people, it starts to get harder to do. And I don't have an answer as to how you keep it, because I wouldn't necessarily say we've been able to in my previous company. In this one, it's still the right size where people know each other, and
Yeah, so I'm of the philosophy that you should never go out of fundraising mode, and really the ideal time to raise a new round of funding is immediately after you've closed your last round, because you're flush with cash, you can take all of these meetings, and you're in the really enviable position of saying like, oh, well, yeah, you're a great investor, like it's really interesting talking to you, like we don't need money right now, but like maybe if you offer us very, very good terms, at this point, 6 months out, 9 months out, like we could take your money and that would be wonderful. So I've been spending, percentage-wise, I'm not totally sure what it is. Maybe like a quarter of my time, not that much, 20% maybe on the fundraising side of things recently, and it seems like a good amount. Just like maintaining a broader network of people who are in line with this mission, and also like I feel very strongly that now-ish, like this year, next year will be like the best times to raise capital, and so I kind of want to strike while the iron is hot there.
Yeah, I think it's surprising how much time you need to spend raising money. I think when I first started my first startup, I was thinking, okay, we're going to raise money and then they'll just go away and then we can focus on building the business. But it doesn't work that way. I think that someone once joked that CEO title is Chief Extraction Officer. I think you never stop fundraising, and totally agree that raising money when you've already raised money right then is the best time, and you never stop. I think I probably spend 25% of my time, although last year it was more than that, and you just have to keep planting seeds, because there's a serendipity with fundraising. It's not the investor's timing has to align with yours sometimes, and so having lots of seeds planted out there when it's time to raise a larger round is important. So for better or for worse, fundraising is always going to be a big priority for you and your startup.
I wouldn't add any to that, but I think there was a part of the question in there that had to do with lifestyle, and I think.
The technology, yeah.
Oh, I see.
So how do you balance like in your daily life technology, fundraising, and management sort of?
I think part of it is you have to hire people to kind of break that into pieces, because I wish I could spend more time on the technology. It's just the reality of hiring people, raising money, making sure the strategy's aligned, and then communicating that strategy takes up the majority of my time. And so my ability to roll up my sleeves and look at data isn't. I wish I had more time doing it. But at the end of the day, if you've hired people that you trust that can do that, then you let them do it. And it depends on the size of your company, but I wish it was more time on the technology, certainly personally speaking.
I guess I didn't really look at the students and what their education is, but I assume they're mostly technical people.
It's mostly engineers. We have a mix of a few kind of creative types to give group dynamics that kind of shift in thinking. And most people are senior level, like higher level undergrads or grad students.
Right. Okay. Well, if you're technically trained people and you're thinking of doing a startup, I would strongly urge you to partner with someone who has a background in finance. It's a very unusual environment, and I just think that I've seen many examples of scientists or engineers with brilliant ideas, game-changing ideas, and unfortunately they've never been able to carry it off because they've either tried to do it themselves or they just haven't partnered with the right people. So, I mean, there's no question that fundraising is an essential ingredient to bringing a concept to market. So, I think the prudent thing to do is to go with someone who has a great deal of expertise in that area. And then that person will spend 80 to 100% of their time working on raising capital. And then you yourself maybe only 25%, providing support to that person. And then you can spend the rest of the time doing management, or hopefully, if you're lucky, actually working on your technology.
So I think that the best founding teams are a blend. So the technical person, and then the product person, and then someone who really understands the customer, or can do the sales. As a CEO, I mean, probably 40% or more of my time is spent fundraising. I think I consider my job to fundraise to make sure that the company is adequately capitalized and to set the vision and to build the team. And so, I try to take on most of that fundraising so that the engineering can still happen. And the CTO obviously has to spend a lot of time because we're raising capital together. But we really do try to keep the rest of the team away from it so that they can do what they do well.
Do you kind of find benefits of spending all of your time going into that, and then you find opportunities within that to spend on yourself, or how does it work?
I would say if you are worried about free time, you shouldn't do a startup. It's way too hard. It's amazing how many ups and downs there are, and how many people will tell you it's not going to work. The regulatory regime, isn't going to be there. It's going to be too expensive. You don't have the right people. I'm not going to invest in your company, and you just get beaten down all the time. And if you don't have, you said fortitude, and you're worried about kind of your lifestyle, it's too tall a mountain to climb, because you'll just get tired. You'll just get tired.
I would probably forget about sleep as well. It's, besides not having enough time, just sort of, waking up in the middle of the night and just staring at your computer screen and crying for a while. That's pretty common. Yes, it's I definitely agree with Nathan. It's just
But it can be done. I mean, I have 3 kids. I spend lots of time with them and my wife and the company, so it's doable. Just it takes up all of your time between those things. And I don't know.
probably a lot of travel
Yeah.
involved as well.
Yeah, I definitely don't have any free time, but there's nothing else I'd rather be doing, so it works out well.
Well, I think this has been a good panel. Thank you, everybody, for participating.